Prepare to die. The marketing wing of Bandai Namco, then Namco Bandai, took gaming culture's mimetic reaction to the learning curve of From Software's Dark Souls series to heart when it came to the subtitle of the first game's PC port. And the marketing campaigns have only been scaled up for subsequent entries in the franchise. Dark Souls 3 at one point featured an intense chicken wing eating contest to show off how hardcore the game was, somehow. Forum chatter, multiplayer trolling, and exhaustive lore videos seem to back up this notion of difficulty appreciation among the more adamant fans of the franchise known as Soulsborne, a portmanteau given to From's action RPG franchise that includes sister IP Bloodborne. The obnoxious mantra of "get good" that belches out from the series' most, let's say, enthusiastic supporters puts the impetus entirely on the players to adapt to an unforgiving universe. The implication being, From Software need take no responsibility to help its users. But despite some players, and Bandai Namco's marketing department, making a fetish of the Soulsborne series' difficulty, the games themselves are not as cruel and unforgiving as it may seem. The first Dark Souls is a great example, and is arguably the first title most players attempted in the franchise, given the niche exclusive release of its predecessor, Demon's Souls, on the PlayStation 3. In the Undead Northern Asylum, Dark Souls' tutorial section, we see a design team taking great pains to train players in the kind of routines they can expect from the rest of the game, and the tactics they should use to get the most enjoyment out of it. How? Well, follow us as we go almost literally step by step through the opening hour of Dark Souls, and we'll explain. Immediately following a short introductory cutscene, players find themselves standing in a prison cell next to a corpse with an ethereal, floating ember of white light hovering above it. Interacting with the dead body grants us an item, cluing newcomers into the fact that this mysterious flame is the game's unique take on the item marker. We can honestly spend an entire video discussing From's use of item markers, which we'll here refer to as glowies. These visual indicators have played triple duty over the course of the Soulsborne franchise, but for this moment in the tutorial, we come to recognize them as useful loot icons. Interacting with this particular glowy grants us the key to our cell. As we open the cell door, the asylum's drab color palette also serves to emphasize some glowing red-orange symbols on the floor, their coloration evoking a smoldering fire. From these two objects alone, the item marker from before and these symbols, we can already determine that fire will be a central element to the lore and world of Dark Souls. For now, we interact with the symbols, the prompt referring to them as a message. Selecting them brings up a text box explaining camera control. Observant players will here notice that there is no fading out of the game's background audio or freezing of on-screen action, a warning that, unlike most other games, bringing up menu information will not pause the action during this adventure. Light is a key tool in the developer's arsenal when it comes to not only setting the tone of a scene or area, but also guiding the player's eye line toward critical focal points. Most of us have found ourselves in a darkened courtyard or wide-open cavern sometime in our gaming career, our exit almost jarringly indicated by a flickering light bulb or other light source emanating around the one door we are meant to walk through. As the player takes stock of the hallway around them, we see that age-old technique employed by From as a subtle goading of player behavior, hinting at the type of observant play that most benefits those new to Dark Souls. Standing a few steps into the hallway, the dull color of the left-hand wall and the lit torches upon it help highlight three distinct features within the space. First, some indistinct creatures standing beneath the torch sconces. Secondly, on the ground, more smoldering notes. Lastly, and most dramatically, the contrasting right-hand wall further down the hallway, where some barred windows peek out at a massive, lumbering creature pacing in the background. Walking down the hallway to the second note, which sits next to our first NPC encounter, players read and learn about the input needed to attack. The third note, next to our second foe, explains how to implement a strong attack. These two creatures are non-aggressive. It won't be long until we come to understand just how rare that is. In this hallway, players may already begin to see the value of a steady, observant pace in From Software's worlds. The designers reinforce the fact that useful information comes from reading notes, at least until the ones written by other players start appearing. And all newcomers get their first taste of From's almost playful tendency toward intimidation with the massive creature on the other side of the wall. Our fourth note precedes the staircase taking us out of the hallway, and explains the sprint function. Following the stairs up leads players to a landing overlooking a flooded room. The tutorial's fifth note, detailing the lock-on feature that keeps a single enemy tagged and in focus during combat, sits glowing in the corner. Reaching the note, The third enemy of the game comes into view, placed in a wide enough section of the ground floor for the player to have an opportunity to try out that lock-on feature they just learned. Once this latest adversary is killed, locked onto or not, we again see torches, vivid against the darker blue-hued room, used to guide the player's eye line, this time leading them to the exit in the right-hand corner of the room. Following the torches leads to an upward ladder, its rungs standing out against the slimy green walls. Climbing said ladder brings the player to a courtyard, a nearby note explaining that bonfires restore health. Sitting squarely in the center of the courtyard is our first bonfire, a flimsy sword jutting out from a campfire mound. Lighting the bonfire activates the player's respawn point and sounds off a satisfying audio effect, a strip of black space cutting across the screen to let us know that indeed, this bonfire is lit. Those players that then activate the bonfire a second time will get their first look at resting, where the player character sits down and a hazy mist surrounds the immediate vicinity. This mist acts as a loading buffer to reset the enemies in the area, but its soft haze also gives off a faint sense of ease. Most new players couldn't tell you for sure yet, but some might get the feeling that resting at bonfires is where they are safest in the Soulsborne universe. Whether or not players rested at this first bonfire, it would be difficult to not guess where to go next. A pair of massive, bright doors sit atop a small staircase directly in front of the bonfire. Those players that choose to ignore them and explore further will only find a locked doorway to the right. Entering the gigantic doors and running into the center of the room will prompt the player's first encounter with an aggressive enemy, which just so happens to be a boss. The Asylum Demon, bearing a striking resemblance to the lumbering creature we saw earlier in the hallway, jumps down to us with a resounding thud. Its health bar pops into the bottom of our screen. It is possible for newcomers to fell our demon pal here in this first battle, but only with some serious dedication and luck. The player character is only capable of removing tiny slivers of health at this stage, no matter what the player's chosen class. From Software uses this first boss to again emphasize the importance of observing the environment. A series of large pots clutter the perimeter of the boss arena. Smashing through the pots is, first of all, fun, but will eventually reveal a way out and away from the Asylum Demon's club. On the left-hand side of the room is a downward staircase that leads out of the arena. Once players find, and most likely frantically roll their way into it, a gate closes behind them with a loud clang, an audio cue to the fact that no enemies can follow, although the Asylum Demon can manage to clip through to damage the player if close enough. Descending this new staircase will reveal Dark Souls' second bonfire, in one of From's favorite foreshadowing techniques. When a camera is under the control of an audience, it takes away a lot of the creator's ability to conventionally frame things within the environment. Outside of cutscenes, there is no real way to cut away to important elements within an arena, and tightening or loosening the camera's distance from the player character to draw focus can cause confusion if not done smoothly enough. One technique that still works, however, is using the environment itself as a frame. Designers can use props, thresholds, or really any set of bordered objects within a game space as a means of highlighting necessary points of interest, by centering them within these frames within the larger frame of the player's screen. Provided the player keeps the camera generally straight as they move forward, they can be naturally funneled into an angle where the framed point of interest is visible. One of the most effective methods of in-game framing, done especially well in the Soulsborne franchise, is doorway framing, visible here with the second bonfire of the Dark Souls tutorial. As the player moves down the linear staircase, the threshold of the doorway comes into view, and centered in the middle of this frame within a frame is the player's next point of safety. Another note provides our next step, asking that we find a shield. As if to punctuate that request, an arrow will fly at any player passing a nearby archway. Peering down the archway, players will see another hallway, a bow-equipped undead firing potshots from the opposite end. An item glowy sits slightly to the side of the hallway, drawing attention to a break in the wall that leads to a room. Inside the room is the aforementioned shield, and a note detailing basic menu navigation and guard controls. Re-entering the hallway with their new method of defense, players can inch down to the undead archer, who hightails it once things get too close. At the end of the hallway sits an item glowy containing the basic weapon of the player's chosen character class, a staff for a sorcerer, a mace for a cleric, etc., and a note about item switching. No matter which class the player chose, their basic weapon is more powerful than the default sword-held weapon and worth switching out for. Taking out the cowardly archer down the way eventually brings the player to another torchlit hallway, with a bit of Soulsborne iconography at the end. From the first fog door here to the last one in Dark Souls 3, From Software always managed to set players on edge during their first playthroughs with these looming portals. Even before we all came to understand that a boss fight is often waiting behind a fog door, their opaqueness and prompt-activated slow traversal make them an apprehensive opposite to the comforting glow of the bonfire haze. Passing through it, our first-time players are greeted with a broken door and a familiar-looking knight visible not too far away. The overlook to the left has a note on how to backstep and roll, which newcomers will need as they soon overcome their first trap. The path to the left leads to a dead end, an item glowy sitting inaccessible on top of a broken staircase. This will by no means be the last time a loot marker will be used as a pathfinding tool in a Dark Souls game, providing assurance to players that, yes, you can eventually find yourself wherever there are items to get. Returning to the landing, following the right-hand path leads to a completed staircase, down which is the unlockable side to the door leading back to the courtyard with the first bonfire. This is the first of many in-area shortcuts that the player can discover, a core part of the Soulsborne exploration gameplay loop, and always a happy find. If a player did not pick up on the importance of taking in all corners of each new environment in Dark Souls by now, a boulder to the face is about the least subtle way to drive that point home. Those that scouted out the entire environment will be able to spot the trap before it is activated, and subsequently adopt a more cautious approach to minimize the impending damage. Any players not putting their newfound backstep or rolling knowledge to use will get a great big rock to the face courtesy of a savvy undead. Taking out the undead leads to a locked door, and turning around provides a big clue on where to go next. The crashing boulder opened up a section of wall at the base of the staircase, through which the player can meet and speak with the knight from the opening cutscene. Our wounded friend has just enough time to tell us our purpose, ringing the Bell of Awakening, and give us the all-important health restoration item, the Estus Flask. A note within the room explains that the limited uses of the Estus Flask are restored each time the player rests at a bonfire. The wounded knight will only give up the key to the door on top of the staircase once most of his dialogue is exhausted. From Software is here teaching the player to repeatedly talk to each friendly NPC until bits of dialogue are outright repeated, in order to get the most out of each exchange. Cruel players can outright kill the knight at any point. The items he gives will then appear on his dead body, or they can simply leave the room. Should players not kill the knight, the sound of an attack can be heard once they leave the room, the knight having gone if they check back. Opening the door at the top of the stairs, players find notes on dual wielding, jump, and kick attacks. Further down the way is a note detailing how enemies in the area are revived, like the player's Estus Flask, each time they rest at a bonfire. An item glowy relinquishes a secondary item attached to a player's chosen character class. 3 enemies, 2 melee, 1 ranged, await the player in an ambush once the building opens up to the roof, giving a rough and tumble entry point to basic group enemy combat techniques. The 2 melee undead will attempt to tease the player out into the open and within the range of the archer undead, but the player also has an opportunity to draw one or both of the melee undead back into a more favorable position on a wider part of the roof. Surviving their first ambush, players can find a note on a nearby overlook that details plunging attacks and spell casting. This becomes an immediately useful technique should the player then pass through a second fog door onto a balcony above the Asylum Demon boss arena. Those that explore to the right find notes on the advanced combat techniques of parrying enemy attacks and backstabbing for critical damage, along with a more challenging fight and a locked door. Once players pass through the second fog door and stare down the Asylum Demon from above, they have a limited time to try out the plunging attack before the boss leaps up and destroys the balcony. Should the player successfully implement a plunging attack, they'll take out a massive portion of the demon's health bar. While From Software doesn't give the player an environmental cheat for all bosses, the trials involved in getting to this little trick at least cue players into looking for them at every opportunity. Taking down the Asylum Demon is comparatively simple once the player is properly equipped, mostly requiring careful attention to its wide windups prior to attacking and rolling toward it during its broader sweeps. There are literally hours of more technically precise videos on the subject of Soulsborne bosses. We will not pretend to offer anything new here. Once the player vanquishes their first boss, they are given the key to the other large set of doors leading out of the arena. Beyond the door lies a hill littered with ruins. Reaching the top prompts a cutscene where the player is suddenly descended upon by a gigantic bird. The player character is then shown flying through the air, clutched in the bird's claws, landing in the Firelink Shrine where, as many a player-written note will tell them across the rest of this and any other Soulsborne game, the real fight begins. Training a new player to press certain buttons to perform set actions is relatively simple. What is an innately more complex task is using this learning space to introduce newcomers not just to the mood of your game, but how best to first play it. Dark Souls' tutorial is a masterwork in leading new players to conclusions and practices that are necessary to best enjoy what is a very deliberate and unrelenting experience. Like any good design team, From Software will come to fiddle with these techniques, marking available paths with loot markers, center framing points of interest in arch and doorways, telegraphing traps, and environmental storytelling throughout the rest of the game to great effect. A rather insidious Dark Souls trick is the use of flowers with a glow similar to item markers, leading players to fall off cliffs in a later level. The Undead Northern Asylum introduces and reinforces the chief tactics players should employ for area exploration from the first moment it grants players control. At any time, a player could take off in a rush, taking on groups of enemies at once and playing Dark Souls in much the same way as a more straightforward action game. Their likelihood of success with that tactic is low, considering the steady pace of combat and the hidden traps, but it is possible. But in seeding the foundations of the slower-paced, note-reading, NPC chatting, and shortcut-finding gameplay loop that makes up the vast majority of Dark Souls' playtime, From Software crafts one of the most effective uses of tutorial space in modern gaming. The key word in Prepare to Die isn't die, it's prepare.